Y vamos a comenzar presentando a quienes ya están en el escenario. En primer lugar, está con nosotros el Coordinador Nacional para el Conocimiento y Uso de la Biodiversidad, CONABIO. CONABIO National Coordinator. Please give a big applause for Dr. José Sarukhan. Muchas gracias. Y para hacer la introducción que el doctor Sarukhan merece, vamos a ceder el uso de la palabra al CEO de World Wildlife Fund and former Mayor of Toronto. Please hear David Miller.
Good morning, everyone. And buenos dias a todo. So welcome to this morning's session in which we're going to build on the work of this fantastic conference, which is focused on the themes of how we measure prosperity to ensure inclusive society, and many particular examples of excellent work towards that goal. Today, the focus will be more on environmental sustainability. How do we ensure that as human beings, we're living within the planet's boundaries while building an inclusive and prosperous society? We know that there are serious challenges today. We know, for example, that we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels at the rate we do today if we're not to experience serious droughts in some parts of the world, serious floods in others, huge impacts on agriculture and people's way of life, and the consequences for human beings and for nature. This morning, we're blessed with a terrific speaker who we will hear from in just a moment, who is the national coordinator of the Mexican Commission on Biodiversity. And I must say to those of us here from Mexico, as a Canadian, we do not have a National Commission on Biodiversity. I was extremely impressed, Professor, that Mexico has this commission. Professor José Sarukhan, who is the national coordinator of that commission and is a longtime professor at the National University of Mexico, UNAM, and he's going to speak about biodiversity in food. How do we sustain, as a country or as countries, a sovereign position on food production in the face of climate change? You know, Mexico is a country very rich in biological diversity, including wild biological diversity. And how can we take lessons learned in Mexico and apply those internationally on this very serious issue of how human beings can live together inclusively and in prosperity but within the planet's boundaries. Professor, I know we're delighted that you're able to join us for this conference. We feel blessed you're here, and we're very much looking forward to your remarks. Professor, over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to start thanking INEGI and Eduardo Sojo and OECD, José Ángel Gurría, for the invitation to be here with you and present this link between the natural surroundings of humanity and its well-being and the future, certainly, on the well-being of every single human being in this planet. My subject ¿está en la presentación? All right. It's how can we use biodiversity for the future, especially in adapting to the climate change, which is a big threat. Let me talk just 1 minute about the National Commission on Biodiversity. Many of you don't know about it. This is a interministerial commission, 10 secretaries or ministries. It is a demand research organization that generates knowledge, intelligence for decision-making in the country in terms of managing, conserving, using rationally the natural capital of the country. It is a world-class institution on the bioinformatics of this part of the biology. And also, it is, I am sure, the largest georeference database system in the world for a country that uses this as a backbone of all its work. And obviously, it's become a public resource. Every single element of information is produced, is made available to all people, from children, some of them to work with their homework, others to the ministers of different secretaries. All right. That's the web page for those of you who want to access it and have a look of what it is. Now, the subject I'm going to talk is how can biodiversity, this very vague term that many people don't quite grasp it, can be used to two important things that are facing us in the future. One is the adaptation to the vagaries of climate change, which is the only way which I really can think of using biodiversity to help us adapt. And the second is how can this adaptation have to do with the insurance of food sovereignty for the future? And that is really the subject. Just quickly, for those of you who are not very close to the concepts of biodiversity, biodiversity is all of these. Oh, it obviously doesn't serve to point. From the ecosystems, which are these huge forests, tropical forests, temperate forests, mangroves, swamps, etc., that contain all the biodiversity in the world, that give us services, environmental services, which are just now we are starting to value, to really recognize the importance that they have for human well-being all over the world. The second level are the species which are contained in those ecosystems. And those species are the way in which we account for the richness of biodiversity in different countries. And the third, and in this case, most important for the talk, element is the genetical diversity that organisms have, the genetical diversity that we have already in this room, but also the genetic diversity that is present in any assemblage of species in any place in the planet. And one element which goes very close hand in hand with that element of genetic diversity is cultural diversity. If you have a look at the planet in terms of where are the areas with the largest biological diversity, are those areas in which you have the largest cultural diversity. And it's obvious. I mean, this diversity of cultures generate or are produced in the areas where there are more resources, people can interact with more elements of their environment. And also they interact with that biodiversity, producing a new element of biological diversity, which are the cultivated plants, unless that is the sustenance for everyone in this planet. You had biodiversity for breakfast this morning, and you are going to have it for lunch later on, so we live on that. And that is exactly the area in which this interaction between cultural and biological diversity cross. There are two different terms on this issue of food security. The one is the concept that FAO produced, which is security when all people at all time have access to safe food in a nutritious manner, and which satisfies the dietary needs of a community. But there is another conception of food security, which has to do more with the elements of human elements. The one is the right of people to really choose a healthy, culturally appropriate sustenance, which is produced in an ecologically sustainable manner. I'm going to talk about that in a moment more, and that have the right to choose its own agricultural and alimentary systems, which are really part of the culture. Agriculture is the first word that we more or less invented that has to combine culture, a knowledge of your surroundings with the production of food. Now, there are a few bullets which I think are extremely important on this to have in mind. The first is the manner in which we are going to feed population by the middle of this century is going to determine how much biodiversity or how many ecosystems are going to remain in this planet. And we depend absolutely on these ecosystems for the well-being of all mankind in the planet. And we know that agriculture is the main driver of ecosystem loss. It has to be. You cannot plant corn under a temperate forest or maize under a tropical forest. You have to remove it in order to plant it. And in this trade-off, you lose a number of services, environmental services. You gain another service, and that's quite true, and that has maintained humanity all the way from the last 10, 14,000 years. But we haven't learned to really balance those trade-offs and to understand how much are we losing, how much are we winning, are we doing a good business, or we are not doing a good business. And that's a subject which is really still open to a lot of work, to a lot of evaluation and assessment. What kind of impacts have had agriculture on the planet? Well, these are the forests 8,000 years ago. These are the forests presently. It's a really huge reduction on the planetary waste. And for those who live in Mexico, the light green areas are the tropical forest. 150 years ago in Mexico, the dark areas are those forests remaining today. It's in many cases less than 3% in several of the states, like Veracruz, for example. The second point is that high input agriculture or high-tech agriculture is not any longer sustainable. I mean, it cannot possibly be sustainable either from the economical or the ecological point of view. It has a large number of social, economic, and environmental externalities that are unacceptable. We are measuring this. Many of the problems that we have of inequality in the planet are derived precisely from the enormous externality these high-tech agricultural systems are producing. One example of this, but there are many examples, I'm not going to tire with this, is the way in which, for example, inputs, in this case, nitrogen is being used. This is in the Mississippi catchment. The red colors are the amount of nitrogen which is being applied, and all that drains from the Mississippi River in New Orleans and goes into the Gulf of Mexico, and it produces huge areas which are denominated dead zones or dead seas, in which there is no animal life because the oxygen is depleted by the amount of algae flourishing in the area, which die, and dying, they deplete the oxygen in the column of water, and there is virtually no animal life that can exist. Well, this is a pretty big area in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's not the only one. There are about 100 and so many in the planet, which are exactly the same condition in areas which are similar to the Mississippi Basin. So this is one of the many, many impacts that high-tech agriculture is having, and nobody pays for this. Nobody compensates the people who cannot fish any longer in those areas. The cost of the agricultural produce does not involve the cost of the ecological cost, the social cost, etc., the economic cost in these things. A third point is that there is no way that in countries which are ecologically very diverse, like Mexico is, you can have one and only one method of food production that will alleviate all the needs to satisfy the dietary needs of a country. No single agricultural system, no matter which one, is not going to work. You need to have a variety of these agricultural systems applied in different parts of the country to really satisfy the possibilities of generating food, and also taking into account that the people who are doing that thing in Mexico is the quintile or the 20% poorest in the country. The more marginalized and more sort of in the worst social economical conditions in Mexico. These are the number of ecosystems. Only China has more ecosystems than we do, and China is 5 times as large as Mexico, so it really gives you the idea of that the enormous diversity of the country, and each one of those areas has different climates, different soils, different climate regimes, etc., which need to have different considerations in terms of food. And second is that you have a large distribution of a large number of ethnic groups, cultural groups all over the place. This is a map that speaks of the distribution of this group. And one measure of the cultural diversity is the number of languages spoken in a country. And in this case, you can see that Mexico has really the official number of languages for Mexico, and I guess this for the government not to really make have their life made difficult, is only about 60 languages, but linguists actually recognize close to 300 languages in Mexico. I can go into detail on this, but I won't do that. And only Oaxaca has more languages, the state of Oaxaca, than all of Central America put together, and even more languages than all of Europe. So real languages in which people cannot understand each other, even though they are 10 kilometers away from each other. The other thing is that as a result of this, besides the huge biological diversity, Mexico is one of the Vavilov centers of plant domestication. The Russian botanist Vavilov in the past century made a classification of the main areas of origin of cultivated plants. Mexico is one of those 4 or 5 areas. Mexico, Mesoamerica is one of those. And it's the result of the interaction of all these many cultural groups and their natural surroundings. Lots of species, I mean, dozens of species that have been domesticated here and now are all over the world as parts of food. Maize has become the most important crop now being planted and used in the planet. This is a map that shows the presence of all the wild relatives of those species. The thing is that crops do not originate from the blue. I mean, they are selected from existing plants, selected by the work of people, and particularly by the work of women, who were the first experimenters in this process in history, selecting materials, propagating them, and giving them value for food. They were really the first, at least, if not scientists, the first experimenters in the planet. So we have not only many cultivated plants, but also a lot of relatives which have a lot of genetic connections still that they crossbreed with them, so they really constitute an important source of genetical variation. We need to know and understand the traditional ways of agricultural production in the country, see where can we really improve on them with modern science, but learn from these people who have lived from that process for centuries, for generations, how they have done it, what are their tricks, and help them to improve the work. This is something that has not been done in the scale that needs to be done in this country, and certainly in many other countries as well. The last year's report of FAO on the state of food and agriculture made a very important point in recognizing the family units of food production, which, as you can see in the slide, represent by far the bulk of the agricultural production on the planet. It's not the highly technified agriculture, it is these farmers, small farmers, activity that produce close to 70% or 80% of the food production in the planet. So this is where we have to work. This is where we have to go and use their traditional knowledge and their materials and our materials, the genetic materials, to really start producing results that cannot be produced, I think, in my opinion, in any other way. This is a slide that shows that 84% of the farms are farms that are 2 or less than 2 hectares in extension. This is where the agriculture is being produced. It is not in the big, I mean, I have nothing against big farms and mechanized agriculture, but it cannot be the solution to the food production needs, and even less in countries as diverse and ecologically complex as Mexico. We need more public-funded research for agricultural activities. This was stopped at the end of when the Green Revolution was obvious, and they say there's no more need to invest public resources in agricultural research. Let's move the monies to somewhere else. And what has happened is that many countries have lost the sovereignty of knowing exactly what to grow, how to produce it, how to involve the farmers, the small farmers in this process. And there has been, I would say, a very serious privatization of a bit of knowledge which is absolutely crucial for the well-being of humanity. Only a few countries didn't pay attention to stopping public funding on that. China is one of them, Brazil, Argentina, and now you can see where they are in terms of food production. It made a huge difference. It didn't happen in countries like ours. So this is one area in which public policy has to change seriously in order to work better. Now, summarizing a little bit, the genetic diversity that we have in crops is the result of thousands of years of selection. For maize, maybe 6,000 to 7,000 years. For other crops, maybe a little less. but it's thousands of years of selection, of experimentation, which is present there. You have it all over the country. And second, the wide relatives of those plants is not only thousands of years, it's millions of years of genetic selection to adaptation to different ecological conditions. So in there we have a huge wealth of genetic variability that, in my opinion, is really the source of responses to the problems of climate change. One of the things that comes out, and I was very surprised in that FAO report, it's all the, what they call the essential building blocks of innovation in agriculture. You can see they make a lot of sense. There is one which is simply totally absent of the discourse of them: genetic variability of crops. It's not mentioned. It's as if that was sort of given in some place, you can go to Walmart and buy it, whatever. I mean, it's simply not considered in the process, and I think that is a big misconception. Mexico is center of origin of and diversity of maize. We have finished a very large, the largest study in Conavio on the diversity of maize, and gone into the definition of areas of diversity. And this is the kind of variation you can have in maize, that every single race is adapted to a soil, to a climate, to a regime of rains, etc., that really gives you a huge, broad selection of materials to work with. The point is that there is no technology, modern technology, capable of replacing that process of natural diversity. Simply, there is no way, no matter what you can invent on these things. We have to use that material and use it with the people who produce that process and that diversity. The World Bank genes, the gene banks of the world, are only photographs taken of the process of evolution under domestication. It's one bit of the film, not the whole process. And what we need to do is to keep the film, to understand where things come from, so we can really continue in that process of evolution in the plants. We haven't been able to evaluate that process of evolution that is not given a value. I mean, in the national accounts and things like that, nobody cares about the enormous, the service, the evolutionary service that people have done through thousands of years to allow us to have this material. This is one of the things that has to change in really considering the role and the importance of all these small family farming units, which are really maintaining themselves and also maintaining the food in the planet. Many examples of this. The potato blight in Europe in the 19th century was one of the examples on how the resistant plant was not found in Peru or in the Andes, was found in Mexico near Toluca, Metepec, of a plant that was not used for food, a wild species of Solanum that was resistant. Now, how do you value the presence of such diversity, as genetic diversity, if you don't know it? You have to really explore it and use it adequately. Conavio has started the work on a number of these crops. We have a large program that has been put forward. We are trying to coordinate a national-wide effort which will comprise all kinds of disciplines, from anthropology to agroecology to physics to etc., sociology, anthropology, as I was saying, all kinds of actors, from the farmers that are involved in the field to people in farmers' organizations, decision makers, all kinds of institutions, agricultural research institutions, the universities, etc., and all kinds of funding as well from federal funds to international programs. But this has to be a long-term, long vision thing that has to be like a state policy for Mexico in order to really push forward and gain sovereignty in the process. It's a very simple model to put all the values of agricultural and biological diversity together, the cultural value, agronomic value, economic and monetary value, which are two different things, the biological and social values, to really put them together to work and have hundreds of researchers in the country really working in one direction, which is let's use biological diversity to ensure that we can face the problem of food production in the face of a enormously complicated and difficult to predict climate change. All right, I think 2 minutes earlier I finished. Thank you.
Professor Sarukhan, that was a very eloquent and passionate cry, I think, for the respect and importance of biodiversity in the wild. And it's very important to recognize Mexico's leadership and your personal leadership on this issue. And I think your topic fits very well with the themes of prosperity for all and inclusion, particularly when you pointed out so many small family farms form the backbone of agriculture in Mexico. So I want to thank you again. You could tell from the applause of how enthusiastically people heard your remarks. I know there will be lots of questions. Unfortunately, we do have a panel now, so if you have questions of Professor Sarukhan, please take an opportunity to speak to him afterwards. And Professor Jose, thank you so much for being here today, and continue your fantastic work.
Thank you.
Despidamos con un fuerte aplauso al doctor.
Let's thank Dr. Jose Sarukhan, National Coordinator of CONABIO. Thank you.